Section 1. The Execution on Freedom Road. On New Year's Day, 2003. Freedom Road in Walkley, Sheffield was the kind of street where nothing ever happened. It was a quiet, residential road on the west side of the city. Rows of terraced houses lined up one after the other. Families lived there. People parked their cars outside their homes and walked to the corner shop without a second thought. It was the last place in Sheffield you would expect a man to be executed. Lester Divers was 32 years old. He was originally from the Burngreave and Pitsmoor areas of Sheffield, two neighbourhoods on the north side of the city that sat close together and shared a long history. But on this particular night, he was at his girlfriend's house on Freedom Road in Walkley. His girlfriend's name was Sophie Gibson, one he had been there to see in the new year with her, the way thousands of other couples across Sheffield had done that same night. Fireworks had gone off. People had raised their glasses. The calendar had turned from 2002 to 2003. And at some point, after midnight, Lester Divers stepped out of Sophie Gibson's front door, walked to his car, and climbed into the driver's seat. He drove a Lexus. It was parked right outside the house. He got into the car and sat behind the wheel. He had not yet started the engine. He had not yet pulled away from the curb. He was just sitting there, in his car, on a quiet street, in the early hours of New Year's Day. That is when someone stepped up to the vehicle and fired a sawn-off shotgun at point-blank range into his head. The blast killed him. He slumped forward in the driver's seat and his body pressed against the steering wheel, which set off the car horn. The horn blared out across the quiet street. That is how the neighbours knew something had happened. Not a scream, not a shout. Just the long, unbroken sound of a car horn that would not stop, because the man behind the wheel was dead and his weight was pressing down on it. The killer did not hang around. A getaway car was already waiting nearby. The gunman ran to it, got inside, and the car drove away into the night. By the time the neighbours came to their windows and doors to see what was going on, the shooter was gone. All that was left was the Lexus, the horn still sounding, and Lester Divers slumped over in the front seat with a fatal shotgun wound to his head. He was 32 years old. He would never turn 33. His girlfriend, Sophie Gibson, was inside the house on Freedom Road when it happened. The new year had barely started. Across Sheffield, people were still celebrating, still hugging each other, still making plans for the year ahead. And on one quiet street in Walkley, a man had just been shot dead in his car. To the people who knew the public side of Lester Divers, this was a devastating loss. He was, by all accounts, one of the most well-known and well-liked figures on Sheffield's nightlife scene. He worked as a music promoter. He organised events across the city. He was a regular face in the city centre's clubs and bars, someone who seemed to know everyone and who everyone seemed to know. People who met him described him as charming and charismatic. The kind of person who walked into a room and immediately drew people towards him. He had a gold-toothed smile that people remembered long after they met him. He had a large group of loyal friends who genuinely cared about him. Even in a city as big as Sheffield, Lester Divers was hard to miss. He was also a devoted Sheffield United fan. In Sheffield, football is serious. The city is split between two clubs. Sheffield United, known as the Blades, and Sheffield Wednesday, known as the Owls. Lester Divers was a Blades man through and through. He was a familiar face at Bramall Lane, Sheffield United's home ground, and was well known among the club's supporter base. When word spread across Sheffield that Lester Divers had been shot dead on New Year's Day, the reaction was enormous. The news hit hard across Burngreave, Pitsmoor, and the wider city. People were shocked, people were angry, people were heartbroken. This was not just a name in a news report. This was someone that hundreds of people in Sheffield knew personally, someone they had seen just days or even hours earlier. His funeral, held at Christ Church in Pitsmoor, showed the kind of impact Lester Divers had on the people around him. A horse-drawn hearse carried his coffin through the streets to the church. The crowd of mourners who turned up was so large that they could not all fit inside the building. People stood outside in the cold, paying their respects to a man they had known as a friend, a promoter, a presence on the Sheffield scene. It was the kind of turnout you see for someone who has touched a lot of lives, someone whose absence leaves a visible hole in a community. Now, members of Sheffield United's hooligan firm, the Blades business crew, publicly planned what they called a show of strength at the funeral. A message was posted on a forum associated with the group that described Lester Divers as one of their own. It said he was respected by his peers and feared by his enemies, while still keeping a genuine warmth with people who knew him over the years. The message called his death a dark day and said they had lost one of their favourite sons at the young age of 32. The writer said they hoped as many people as possible would attend the funeral and said they would miss that gold-toothed smile. To his friends and family, Lester Divers was a victim. A man cut down too soon. A life taken by senseless violence. But there was another side to Lester Divers. A side that the people closest to him either did not know about or chose not to talk about. And it was this other side that would come to define the story of his murder and the trial that followed. Because according to what Sheffield Crown Court later heard, Lester Divers was not just a music promoter and a football fan. He was also deeply involved in Sheffield's criminal underworld. The court was told he was part of a gang that dealt in hard drugs. Not small amounts. Hard drugs, heroin, cocaine, the kind of substances that fuel entire criminal economies. He and his associates were alleged to have built a reputation for extreme violence against rival criminals and other drug dealers across the city. And that reputation, the prosecution said, was what got him killed. The judge who oversaw the case, Mr. Justice Treacy, I later described the murder as the result of a turf war between two rival gangs involved in the supply of drugs. He called it a well-planned and cold-blooded execution. Those were the judge's exact words. Not a robbery gone wrong. Not a fight that got out of hand. A planned execution carried out on a quiet street against a man who had made powerful enemies in a world where disagreements are settled with violence. According to evidence presented at trial, Lester Divers and his associates were involved in a series of what are known in criminal circles as taxings. A taxing is when one criminal group abducts a person, usually someone involved in crime themselves, and forces them to hand over money, drugs, or both. It is kidnapping for profit, carried out within the criminal world. Bees against people who are unlikely to go to the police because they are criminals too. The court heard that Divers and his group had tortured and kidnapped a number of victims in the period leading up to his murder. They were alleged to have taken thousands of pounds from their targets. One report from the time described how one victim was said to have had every bone in his foot broken. Another victim was said to have had marks scored into his back. Yet another was reported to have handed over a ransom of £30,000. One of the most extreme claims was that a single taxing had netted £500,000 from one victim. These were serious allegations, and they painted a picture of a man who lived two very different lives. In one life, he was the smiling and gold-toothed music promoter who everyone in Sheffield's nightlife scene wanted to be around. In the other life, according to what the court heard, he was part of a violent gang that kidnapped and tortured people for money. It was this second life, the prosecution argued, that led directly to his death on Freedom Road. Because the man who pulled the trigger that night, a 47-year-old named Michael Uller, did not kill Lester Divers at random. This was not a stranger walking up to a car and firing for no reason. Uller, who lived on Honeysuckle Road in the Wincobank area of Sheffield, was connected to a rival drug dealing operation in the city. He was working for another Sheffield drug dealer, a competitor to Divers and his group. And according to what his defence team told the court, Uller had reason to believe that Lester Divers and two other men were planning to kidnap, torture and possibly kill him to extract information about the dealer he worked for. Uller's barrister told Sheffield Crown Court that 3 men, one of whom was Divers, had tried to grab Uller in order to force information out of him about a rival Sheffield drug dealer he was working for. The claim was that Uller shot Divers not as part of a cold-blooded assassination, but because he feared for his own life. He believed that if he did not act first, Divers and his associates would come for him. Whether that was the full truth or just a legal strategy, the reality is that Michael Uller admitted to pulling the trigger. He pleaded guilty to murder before the trial even started. But Uller was not alone that night. The getaway car that sped away from Freedom Road after the shooting was driven by a man named Kevin Smith, aged 42, from Barnsley. And behind the entire plan, the prosecution alleged, was a third man named Craig Allen, aged 39, from Mansfield. Allen was accused of being the organiser, the person who paid Ulla to carry out the killing. The trial that followed would be one of the most dramatic Sheffield had ever seen. Armed police surrounded the Crown Court building for the entire 3-week hearing. The level of security was unlike anything the city's courts had dealt with before. When the verdicts finally came in, after a jury of 7 men and 5 women had deliberated for around 7 hours, chaos erupted inside the courtroom. Half of the packed public gallery stormed downstairs, screaming and shouting, trying to force their way past armed officers and into the main chamber. Proceedings had to be stopped for 10 minutes while police restored order. Sophie Gibson, Lester Diver's girlfriend, sat silently on the front row of the public gallery as the mayhem unfolded around her. And the man accused of masterminding the whole thing, the man the prosecution said had paid for the murder to happen, walked free. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But that is a story for the next section, because what happened inside that courtroom and what happened to the people involved in the years that followed would prove that the murder of Lester Divers was just one chapter in a much larger and much darker story about Sheffield's criminal underworld. The Section 2. The Trial, the Ring of Steel, and the Man Who Walked Free. The trial over the murder of Lester Divers began at Sheffield Crown Court in July 2003, roughly 6 months after the shooting on Freedom Road. 3 men stood accused. Michael Ulla, aged 47, was charged with murder. Kevin Smith, aged 42, from Barnsley, was charged with murder for driving the getaway car. And Craig Allen, aged 39, from Mansfield, was accused of being the man who organised and paid for the killing. A 4th person, Ulla's 21-year-old son, Lee Grantham, was charged with assisting an offender, specifically for burning his father's clothes after the murder and getting rid of the gun. Before the trial even properly started, Michael Ulla pleaded guilty to murder. He admitted that he was the one who had fired the sawn-off shotgun into Lester Diver's head as he sat in his Lexus on New Year's Day. That was not in dispute. What the trial needed to decide was the role of the other men. Was Kevin Smith guilty of murder for driving Ulla to and from Freedom Road that night? And was Craig Allen the mastermind behind the whole thing, the man who paid for a life to be taken? The trial lasted 3 weeks, and from the very first day it was clear this was not going to be a normal court case. Sheffield Crown Court was surrounded by what the local press described as a ring of steel. Armed police officers were stationed around the entire building for the duration of the hearing. The level of security was extreme, even by the standards of serious criminal trials. Also, the authorities knew exactly who would be watching this case from the public gallery. They knew the kind of world Lester Divers had moved in, and they knew that the people connected to that world would be in the building. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution laid out its case. They said the murder of Lester Divers was a well-planned and cold-blooded execution, carried out as a direct result of a turf war between rival drug gangs in Sheffield. The prosecution argued that Craig Allen had paid Michael Ulla to kill Divers, and that Kevin Smith had been brought in to drive the getaway car. The defence told a different story. Ulla's barrister told the court that his client had shot Divers because he feared for his own life. The defence said that 3 men, one of whom was Lester Divers, had tried to kidnap, torture, and kill Ulla in order to force information out of him about a rival Sheffield drug dealer he was working for. In this version of events, Ulla was not an assassin carrying out a contract. He was a man who believed he was going to be grabbed, hurt, and possibly killed, and who decided to strike first. The court heard extensive evidence about the world these men operated in. Sheffield Crown Court was told that Lester Divers, despite his public image as a charming music promoter, was part of a gang responsible for a series of violent crimes against other drug dealers and criminals. His group was alleged to have kidnapped and tortured a number of victims in the period leading up to his murder, forcing them to hand over thousands of pounds. This was the motive the prosecution presented, a gang war in which both sides were willing to use extreme violence and in which Lester Divers was ultimately the one who lost. Key witnesses were called to give evidence about what happened inside Michael Uller's house on Grey Street in Pittsmore, both before and after the shooting. A woman named Lisa Edwards, who had been staying at the house, told the court about the days leading up to the murder. Edwards testified that she, Uller, and Uller's son, Lee Grantham, were all addicted to heroin and cocaine. She said she had spent the morning of the murder taking heroin in the house. Edwards broke down in tears on the witness stand as she described watching Michael Uller saw off a shotgun in preparation for what he called the job. She watched him cut down the barrel of the weapon in the house, and she knew something was being planned. She told the court that when Uller and Smith came back from the shooting, they were shouting and in a hurry. Kevin Smith told Edwards that if anyone asked, she was to say she had been with him all day and all night. He kept repeating it, she said. He told her she should never ask where he had been or where he was going. Edwards also described what happened the morning after the murder. She told the court that she had helped Craig Allen count a carrier bag full of cash after the killing. The bag contained more than £5,000 in English and Scottish 20, 10 and £5 notes. The morning after a man had been shot dead on a quiet street in Walkley, the people involved in his death were counting money. The court heard that on that same morning, the morning after the murder, Michael Uller, Kevin Smith and Craig Allen went shopping together. They came back with carrier bags full of new clothes, jeans, tops, trainers, jackets. Uller bought 2 double beds for a new house he was setting up in Sutton in Ashfield, a town in Nottinghamshire. He gave his girlfriend, a woman named Josie Perry, £1,000 in cash and told her to go shopping in Mansfield. She went to Argos and Matalan. She bought a washing machine, a fridge freezer and kitchen accessories. A man had been executed 12 hours earlier, and the people connected to his death were furnishing a new home. Another witness, Josie Perry's teenage son Dwayne, told the court he had lied to police because he was frightened. He admitted being in Uller's house when his father sawed off the shotgun. He admitted being there when Uller came back from the shooting and told Lee Grantham to get rid of the big fella, meaning the gun. But Dwayne said he did not think Uller, Smith and Allen were planning to shoot someone. He said Uller had told him that people were after him, and that he needed the gun for his own protection. The prosecution also called a woman named Sarah Brazier, who testified that Craig Allen had paid her £50 or £100 to spend the night before the shooting with Kevin Smith. The implication was that Allen was keeping Smith occupied and in place the night before the murder, making sure the getaway driver was where he needed to be when the time came. After 3 weeks of evidence, the jury of 7 men and 5 women went out to consider their verdicts. They deliberated for around 7 hours. When they came back into the courtroom, they delivered 3 decisions. Michael Uller, guilty of murder. He had already admitted it. Kevin Smith, guilty of murder for driving the getaway car. Craig Allen, not guilty. The man the prosecution said had organised and paid for the killing of Lester Divers was found not guilty by the jury and walked free. What happened next turned Sheffield Crown Court into something closer to a riot. The moment the verdicts were read out, spectators in the full public gallery, who had been seated in a separate balcony above the courtroom, jumped to their feet. They started shouting abuse at Smith and at Allen. Then half of them charged downstairs and tried to force their way past the armed police officers and into the main courtroom. Men were bellowing, men were struggling with police. One man managed to get the courtroom doors open before he was stopped. Armed officers who had been stationed around the building throughout the trial grabbed people, blocked doorways, and tried to hold back the crowd. Sophie Gibson, Lester Divers' girlfriend, and close members of his family were sitting on the front row of the public gallery. They stayed in their seats. They did not move. They sat silently as the chaos erupted around them. While men charged and screamed and fought with police, the people who had loved Lester Divers the most sat perfectly still. The judge suspended proceedings for 10 minutes while police restored order. The jury and the defendants were quickly taken out of the courtroom for their own safety. When the judge returned, he decided that the sentencing of Uller and Smith would not happen that day. It would be carried out the following day instead. The next day, the security was even tighter. Michael Uller and Kevin Smith were brought back to Sheffield Crown Court under heavy police guard and a helicopter escort. Armed officers once again surrounded the building. The judge, Mr. Justice Treacy, sentenced both men to life imprisonment. The Lord Chief Justice later set down a minimum term of 16 years for Uller, meaning he would have to serve at least 16 years before he could even be considered for release on parole. Even then, like all convicted murderers in England and Wales, he would never be truly free. He would remain on licence for the rest of his life and could be recalled to prison at any time if the authorities believed he posed a risk. Kevin Smith also received a mandatory life sentence for his role as the getaway driver. Craig Allen walked out of Sheffield Crown Court a free man. The jury had decided there was not enough evidence to prove he had organised the murder of Leicester divers. But the story of Craig Allen did not end there. Not even close. 9 years after he was cleared of organising the execution of Leicester divers, Craig Allen was arrested again. By that time he was 50 years old. He had left Sheffield entirely. He had moved to Thailand, where he was living in a luxury mansion with a swimming pool, a Thai wife and a child, where he was running an international drug dealing operation that was making him £5,000 a week. He used more than 18 different mobile phones to avoid being tracked. He had earned himself 2 nicknames in the criminal world, the Ginger Ninja and the Little Fella. His empire fell apart in May 2010 when police stopped a 42-year-old man near Junction 37 of the M1 motorway. In the car, officers found 17.5 kilos of heroin and 2 mobile phones. The phones led investigators to Allen, who was coordinating drug distribution from his home in Thailand. A 4-year investigation followed, during which police seized 24 kilos of Class A drugs worth an estimated £1.85 million, as well as nearly €500,000 in cash. Allen eventually moved from Thailand to Amsterdam. In October 2013, armed police from a joint British and Dutch operation arrested him at gunpoint outside an IKEA store in the Dutch city. When they searched his flat in Amsterdam, they found 3 kilos of cocaine, a kilo of heroin, nearly €500,000 in cash, and a cash counting machine. He was extradited to the United Kingdom and brought back to Sheffield Crown Court, the same building where he had been cleared of murder a decade earlier. This time, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to distribute Class A drugs. In 2014, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The Crown Prosecution Service described him as the linchpin of a global drugs conspiracy and one of the most significant drug traffickers ever prosecuted in Yorkshire and Humberside. The man who walked free from a murder trial in 2003 ended up behind bars anyway, serving 2 decades for flooding the streets of South Yorkshire and beyond with heroin and cocaine. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the murder of Leicester divers left behind more than just criminal convictions and prison sentences. It left behind a family, a community, and a legacy of violence that would continue to echo through Sheffield for years to come. Section 3. The Shadow That Stayed. Aftermath and a family caught in the cycle. The murder of Leicester divers on New Year's Day. 2003 did not end when the courtroom doors closed. The sentences were handed down. Michael Uller got life with a minimum of 16 years. Kevin Smith got life. Craig Allen walked free. The legal system had done what it was designed to do. Process the facts, I hear the arguments, deliver a verdict, and move on to the next case. But for the people connected to Leicester divers, and for the streets of Sheffield where his name still carried weight, the aftermath of that shotgun blast on Freedom Road would stretch on for years. In some ways, it has never stopped. To understand what the killing of Leicester divers meant for Sheffield, you need to understand what Burngreave and Pittsmoor were like in the early 2000s. These 2 neighbourhoods sitting side by side in the north of the city were areas that had been shaped by decades of industrial decline. Sheffield was once one of the great steel cities of the world. When the steel industry collapsed in the 1980s, it left behind communities with high unemployment, poverty, and very few opportunities. Burngreave and Pittsmoor were among the areas hit hardest. And where legitimate opportunities disappear, illegitimate ones tend to fill the gap. By the time Leicester Divers was killed in 2003, the drug trade in these neighbourhoods was well established. Heroin and cocaine moved through the streets. Rival groups fought over territory, over customers, over supply lines. The violence was not random. It followed the drug money, and the drug money was significant. Craig Allen alone, the man acquitted of organising Divers' murder, was later found to have been running a drug operation that earned him £5,000 a week. That was just one man in one part of the network. The overall trade across Sheffield's north side was worth far more than that. Leicester Divers had been a major figure in that world. His death did not calm things down. If anything, it showed everyone involved just how high the stakes were. A well-known man with powerful connections had been shot dead at point-blank range outside his girlfriend's house in a quiet residential street on a public holiday. The message was clear. Nobody was untouchable. And in a world where reputation and fear are the currency that keeps people alive, that message sent shockwaves through every level of Sheffield's criminal underworld. The years that followed the Divers' murder saw Burngreave and Pittsmoor become increasingly troubled by gun violence. In 2002, the year before Divers was killed, a father of 7 named Gerald Smith had been shot in the head in a drive-by shooting outside the Afro-Caribbean club on Spittal Hill in Burngreave. He had no involvement in crime. He was simply standing in the wrong place when 9 men from Nottingham arrived in Sheffield on a revenge mission after one of their group had been robbed in a local takeaway. Gerald Smith was an innocent bystander who paid with his life for a dispute he knew nothing about. In 2007, 4 years after the Divers' killing, a 16-year-old boy named Jonathan Matondo was shot dead on the Nottingham Cliff Recreation Ground in Burngreave, close to his home on Verdon Street. His death was connected to a feud between 2 rival gangs in the area known as the S3 and the S4, named after their Sheffield postcodes. Detectives believed Jonathan was shot in revenge for a shooting that had happened the day before, as the feud between the 2 groups spiralled out of control. A man stood trial twice for Jonathan's murder, but was acquitted both times. Nobody was ever jailed for killing him. He was 16 years old. In 2011, an 18-year-old named Deek Ali was killed when he was caught up in a shooting at a birthday party at the Plaza Function Suite on Spittal Hill in Burngreave. Another young life ended by gunfire. Another family destroyed. This was the world that Leicester Divers had operated in, and this was the world that continued to churn after he was gone. The names changed, the gangs changed, but the pattern stayed the same. Drugs, territory, violence, death. And then there was the Divers family itself. In 2017, 14 years after Leicester Divers was shot dead, South Yorkshire Police issued a public appeal for information on the whereabouts of a 22-year-old man named Aaron Divers. Aaron was Leicester's nephew. Hind Police said he was wanted in connection with a number of serious offences. The force released his photograph and warned members of the public not to approach him. Within days, it was revealed that the serious offences Aaron Divers was wanted for included the murder of a 23-year-old man named Asil al-Essay, who had been shot dead in broad daylight in the Daniel Hill area of Upperthorpe, Sheffield, on Saturday, February 18, 2017. Asil al-Essay had just pulled up outside a house for a family gathering to celebrate his twin sister's engagement when he was gunned down. He was rushed to hospital but could not be saved. Aaron Divers was eventually taken into custody in Sheffield in September 2017, roughly 3 weeks after police first released his name and photograph to the public. 2 other men, Matthew Cohen, an aged 28 of Ortybridge, and Dale Gordon, aged 33 of Crosspool, were both charged with Asil al-Essay's murder. The nephew of Leicester Divers, the man who had been executed on Freedom Road in 2003, was himself wanted over a fatal shooting in Sheffield 14 years later. The violence had not left the family. It had followed them, and it did not stop there. In September 2018, 15 years after Leicester Divers was killed, another one of his nephews made headlines in Sheffield. Noel Ramsey, aged 22, from Nottingham Street in Burngreave, stabbed a young man named Fahim Hersey to death outside Cineworld at the Centertainment Complex in Sheffield. Both groups had gone to the cinema that night to watch the same film, a British action movie called The Intent 2. One where there was pre-existing bad blood between Noel Ramsey and one of Fahim Hersey's friends, a man named Osman Jama. Violence broke out in the car park. During the fight, Ramsey was stabbed in the leg by one of Hersey's group. The attacker dropped the knife and walked away. But Ramsey picked the knife up off the ground. And as Fahim Hersey, who was 22 years old and from the Broomhall area of Sheffield, walked towards him, Ramsey plunged the blade into his chest. The knife went through his heart. Fahim Hersey was taken to the Northern General Hospital by his friends, but he could not be saved. He died that night. CCTV cameras at the Centertainment complex captured much of what happened. Footage showed Ramsey walking away from the scene with the knife before disposing of it near a bin. A second man, our 22-year-old Leighton Morris from Ferrars Road in Tinsley, picked up the knife from the bin and removed it from the scene entirely. Ramsey was arrested after turning up at hospital seeking treatment for his own stab wound. He was charged with murder and stood trial at Sheffield Crown Court. During the trial, he pleaded guilty to an alternative charge of manslaughter, claiming he had acted in self-defence. The Crown Prosecution Service accepted the plea. Judge Jeremy Richardson, QC, directed the jury to return a not guilty verdict on the murder charge. Ramsey was sentenced to 5 years in prison. When the sentence was reported, the Sheffield Star revealed that Noel Ramsey was the nephew of murdered underworld boss Lester Divers. The paper noted that Ramsey had struck out and killed a man, despite knowing the heartache that serious violence causes, after his own uncle was murdered 15 years earlier. 5 years for taking a 22-year-old man's life. Leighton Morris, who had helped dispose of the murder weapon, pleaded guilty to assisting an offender and was jailed for 6 months. Fahim Hersey's family and the wider public were outraged at the length of Ramsey's sentence. But that was what the law allowed under a manslaughter conviction. Superintendent Mel Palin of South Yorkshire Police called the incident a stark reminder of the tragedy that can result from carrying a knife. Then, in 2021, another member of the extended family entered the justice system. Isaac Ramsey, aged 18 from Andover Street in Burngreave, was convicted of manslaughter over the death of 35-year-old Marcus Ramsey. And Isaac Ramsey was Noel Ramsey's cousin, both connected by blood to the Divers family. Marcus Ramsey, a father of 2, had been stabbed when violence broke out at a house party on Horninglow Road in Firth Park, Sheffield, the previous summer. Marcus had been trying to protect his brother when Isaac Ramsey and another 18-year-old named Ruben Moreno, both armed with knives, attacked. Marcus was fatally stabbed. CCTV captured Ramsey and Moreno producing their knives and then running from the scene as their victim lay dying on the ground. The pair went on the run for several weeks before being caught. Moreno was found guilty of murder. Isaac Ramsey was found guilty of manslaughter. 2 cousins, both behind bars for killing someone, both connected to the Divers family, both from Burngreave. The Sheffield Star ran the story under the headline that 2 Sheffield cousins had both been jailed for manslaughter 3 years apart after fatal stabbings. It traced the family line back to Lester Divers and the execution on Freedom Road in 2003. The paper laid out the connections clearly. Noel Ramsey, jailed for killing Fahim Hersey in 2018, was the nephew of Lester Divers. Isaac Ramsey, convicted over the death of Marcus Ramsey in 2021, was Noel's cousin. The same extended family. The same area of Sheffield. The same cycle of violence playing out across generations. There is a phrase that gets used when people talk about communities like Burngreave and Pittsmore, the cycle of violence. It sounds like something from a textbook. It sounds like something a politician says in a press conference before moving on to the next topic. But when you look at the Divers family and the people connected to them, you can see exactly what that phrase means in real life. A man is killed. His nephews grow up in the shadow of that killing, in the same streets, surrounded by the same forces that led to his death. And years later, those nephews are standing in courtrooms of their own, charged with taking other people's lives. The cycle does not break itself. It just keeps turning. Freedom Road in Walkley is still a quiet residential street. The houses are still there. People still park their cars outside their front doors. But on New Year's Day 2003, a sawn-off shotgun blast on that street set off a chain of events that rippled through Sheffield for more than 2 decades. 2 men went to prison for the murder. The man accused of ordering it walked free, then ended up in prison anyway for running a global drug empire. The victims' nephews went on to be involved in fatal violence of their own. And the neighbourhoods of Burngreave and Pittsmore continued to be haunted by the same forces, drugs, gangs and guns, that put Leicester divers in the ground in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the story of what happened on Freedom Road is not just about the violence and the criminal underworld. It is also about the questions that the case left behind, questions about justice, about what drives people into these worlds, and about whether anything has really changed in Sheffield since that New Year's Day morning when the neighbours on Freedom Road were woken by the sound of a car horn that would not stop. Section 4. The questions that never go away. More than 2 decades have passed since Leicester Divers was shot dead outside his girlfriend's house on Freedom Road. The calendar has turned from 2003 to 2026. 23 years. And in that time, almost everything about the case has settled into history. The murder, the trial, the ring of steel around Sheffield Crown Court, the chaos when the verdicts came in. The facts are on the public record. The newspaper archives are there for anyone who wants to read them. The names, Leicester Divers, Michael Uller, Kevin Smith, Craig Allen, are permanently tied to one of the most notorious crimes in Sheffield's modern history. But some things about this case have not settled. Some questions are still open. And the biggest one, the one that would have seemed unthinkable to the neighbours on Freedom Road on that New Year's morning in 2003, is this: is the man who pulled the trigger still in prison? Michael Uller was sentenced to life in prison in July 2003. He was 47 years old at the time. The Lord Chief Justice later set his minimum term at 16 years. A minimum term does not mean that a prisoner will be released after that number of years. It means they cannot even be considered for release before that number of years has passed. After the minimum term is served, the prisoner can apply to the parole board, and the parole board decides whether they are safe to be released on licence. If the parole board says no, the prisoner stays behind bars. If they say yes, the prisoner is released but remains on licence for the rest of their life. That means they can be recalled to prison at any time if the authorities believe they pose a risk to the public. Uller's minimum term of 16 years expired in 2019. In May 2020, Yorkshire Live reported that Uller could potentially be due back on the streets, based on the reported 16-year minimum term. The article noted that no further comment on Uller's sentence status was available from the Crown Prosecution Service. What is certain is that since 2019, Uller has been past his minimum term, which means he has been eligible to apply for parole. Whether he has applied, whether the parole board has considered his case, and whether he has been released are details that have not been publicly confirmed in the press as of the most recent reports available. What that means in plain terms is this: there is a real possibility that the man who walked up to a Lexus on a quiet Sheffield street on New Year's Day 2003 and fired a sawn-off shotgun into another man's head at point-blank range could be walking free today, or he could still be behind bars. The public does not know for certain. Under the rules of the parole system in England and Wales, the decisions of the parole board are not always made public, particularly in older cases. Kevin Smith, who drove the getaway car, also received a mandatory life sentence. His minimum term has not been publicly reported in the same detail as Uller's, so his current status is also unclear. Craig Allen, the man accused of organising the murder and who was acquitted at trial, is serving a separate 20-year sentence for conspiracy to distribute Class A drugs, handed down in 2014 at Sheffield Crown Court. Based on that sentence, he would not be eligible for release until at least the mid-2000s at the earliest, depending on parole decisions and time served on remand. Allen was 50 years old when he was sentenced. He would be in his early 60s now. These are the people directly connected to the murder of Leicester Divers. Between them, the killer, the driver, and the man who the prosecution said ordered the hit, There is a combined weight of decades in prison. And yet the drug trade that created the conditions for the murder has not gone away. If anything, it has got worse. In the years since Lester Divers was killed, the neighbourhoods of Burngreave and Pittsmoor have continued to be scarred by gun violence connected to the drug trade. The pattern that was already visible in 2003, rival groups fighting over territory, people being shot in the streets, innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire, has repeated itself over and over again. In September 2019, 2 shots were fired at a 39-year-old man as he got out of his car on Moulton Street in Burngreave. He was not injured. The suspects ran away and their car was later found burned out nearby. In January 2020, a 44-year-old man was shot in his arm on Carlisle Street in Burngreave. In May 2019, a 16-year-old boy was shot in his leg on Spittal Lane, off Spittal Hill, in Burngreave, just after midnight. He was taken to hospital in a serious condition and needed surgery. Police said they believed it was a targeted attack. In April 2020, a 21-year-old man was shot in the chest on Grimesthorpe Road in Burngreave and left in a critical condition. South Yorkshire Police said they were treating it as a targeted attack. Less than a month later, in May 2020, another shooting took place on the same road, Grimesthorpe Road, when a gun was fired towards a group of men in the street. 3 men were shot and taken to hospital. In November 2020, a 20-year-old man named Rami Salem was shot dead inside a property on Grimesthorpe Road South in Burngreave. Another life ended by gunfire. Another family left to grieve. Then came March 29, 2022. Means a 21-year-old man named Lamar Leroy Griffiths was sitting in a friend's blue BMW at the Diamond Hand Car Wash on Burngreave Road when 2 men fired multiple gunshots at the vehicle. Bullets went through the windscreen. Lamar was fatally wounded. He was taken to hospital but could not be saved. He was 21 years old. His mother, Monique Bate, later said that Lamar had been on his way to visit his grandmother that day and was not the intended target of the bullets that killed him. Police confirmed they believed Lamar was not the person the shooters were aiming at. He was in the wrong car, at the wrong time, at the wrong place. The killers fled in a white Ford Fiesta, which was later found burned out in the Darnall area of Sheffield. 2 men, Abdul Hakim and Nasser Nashir, were later jailed for a combined total of over 12 years after pleading guilty to assisting an offender in connection with Lamar's death. Police said the pair had destroyed evidence and helped the 2 murder suspects flee the country. South Yorkshire Police revealed that Hakim and Nashir had made extensive car journeys, driving the suspects to various points of exit within the United Kingdom so they could leave the country. As of March 2025, 3 years after the shooting, the people who actually fired the guns had still not been brought before the courts. Detective Chief Inspector Andrea Bowell, the senior investigating officer, made a public appeal and said police believed the killers had fled abroad. Nobody has been charged with Lamar Leroy Griffiths' murder. In 2023 alone, the Sheffield Star reported on 9 separate shootings in the city, the equivalent of one shooting roughly every 3 weeks. South Yorkshire Police acknowledged what Detective Superintendent Paul Murphy described as a slight increase in firearms discharges and said the force had set up a dedicated armed crime team to deal with the problem. In July 2023, a 42-year-old man was shot in the leg on Moulton Street in Burngreave, the same street where a man had been shot at in 2019, in what police again described as a targeted attack. He suffered life-changing injuries. The same streets, the same postcodes, the same patterns. 20 years after Lester Divers was executed on Freedom Road, Burngreave and Pittsmoor are still dealing with the same forces that put him in the ground. The names have changed. The gangs have evolved. The Pittsmoor Shotter Boys, the S3 and S4 gangs, newer groups that have formed and reformed as members are arrested, jailed, released and replaced. The organisations shift, but the underlying engine stays the same. Drugs come into the area, money is made, territory is contested, people are shot, some die, some survive with life-changing injuries. The police investigate, sometimes people are caught, sometimes they are not. And the cycle continues. A South Yorkshire Police report to the Police and Crime Commissioner's Public Accountability Board in 2020 identified Burngreave as one of the key areas in the fight against gang-related violence and gun crime in Sheffield, alongside Sharrow, Nether Edge, Arbourthorne, Heeley and Grimesthorpe. One of the reports stated that the violence seen across the city was mainly related to competing drug lines and disputes. Chief Superintendent Una Jennings told the meeting that young people getting involved in violent criminal activity connected to drugs appeared to be a driver of much of the trouble. She said the import and export of drugs enabled crime both into and out of the city. That statement could have been made in 2003. It could have been made the day after Leicester Divers was killed. It could have been made at any point in the 20+ years since. The language might change, the rank of the officer saying it might be different. But the substance is always the same. Drugs drive the violence drives the fear drives the silence. And in the silence, more drugs are sold, more territory is fought over, and more people end up dead or in prison. Some of the residents of Burngreave who spoke to reporters after the Diamond Hand Car Wash shooting in 2022 said something that captures the exhaustion of living in a community that has been through this too many times. Some said they were shocked, but others said they were no longer surprised to hear about shootings because serious incidents happen there too often. That is what 2 decades of gun violence does to a neighbourhood. It stops being shocking. It becomes expected. And when violence becomes expected, the outrage fades, the media attention moves on, and the community is left to deal with the aftermath on its own. Leicester Divers was 32 years old when he died. His gold-toothed smile was famous across Sheffield's nightlife scene. His funeral had to be held in a church that was not big enough to hold all the people who came. His name is still known in the Burngreave and Pittsmoor communities more than 2 decades later. But his death did not change anything. It did not break the cycle. It did not stop the drugs. It did not stop the guns. It did not stop young men from making the same choices that pulled him into the world that killed him. And it did not stop his own family members from ending up in courtrooms of their own, charged with taking other people's lives. Freedom Road is still there. The houses look the same. Cars are still parked outside. And the question that hangs over this case, over all cases like it, is simple but impossible to answer with a single sentence. What would it actually take for this to stop? That is not a question this breakdown can answer. But in the final section, we are going to bring it all together. What the murder of Leicester Divers tells us about Sheffield, about the drug trade that runs through it, about the gap between the man his friends loved and the man the court described, and about what is left behind when a sawn-off shotgun blast on a quiet street echoes through a city for more than 20 years. Section 5. 2 versions of the same man and a city that still remembers. There were 2 versions of Leicester Divers. There always were. And the strange thing about this case, the thing that makes it stay with you long after you have heard all the facts and all the names and all the dates, is that both versions were real. The first version was the one his friends knew, the music promoter. The man with the gold-toothed smile who lit up every room he walked into. The devoted Sheffield United fan who was a familiar face at Bramall Lane on match days and a well-known figure among the Blades supporter base. The man who was so popular that when he died, the crowd of mourners at his funeral at Christchurch in Pittsmoor was too large to fit inside the building. A horse-drawn hearse carried his coffin through the streets. People stood outside in the cold because there was simply no room left inside. The Blades business crew posted a tribute that called him one of their favourite sons, taken at the young age of 32. The message said he was respected by his peers, feared by his enemies, and still managed to hold on to genuine warmth from those who knew him. The writer said they would miss that gold-toothed smile. That was Leicester Divers to the people who loved him. A charming man, a larger-than-life figure, a person whose presence in a room was unmistakable and whose absence left a gap that could not be filled. If you had met him in a bar in Sheffield city centre on a Friday night, you would have seen exactly what everyone else saw. A smiling, confident, charismatic man who seemed to know everyone, You would have had no reason to think there was anything else going on beneath the surface. But there was. And the second version of Leicester Divers, the one that came out at Sheffield Crown Court during the trial in July 2003, painted a very different picture. The court heard that Leicester Divers was part of a gang that dealt in hard drugs across the Burngreave and Pitsmoor areas of Sheffield. He and his associates were alleged to have carried out a series of kidnappings and acts of torture against rival criminals and other drug dealers. These were violent, calculated attacks against people in the criminal world. Victims were abducted and forced to hand over large sums of money under extreme duress. The Yorkshire Post reported at the time that Divers was one of a loose group of 3 drug dealers whose reputation for violence was fearfully whispered about by anyone unlucky enough to cross their path. In the neighbourhoods of Pitsmoor and Burngreave, the paper reported, a very different Leicester Divers was known for his brutality. One victim was reportedly said to have had every bone in his foot broken. Another was said to have had marks scored into his back. Another reportedly handed over £30,000. One alleged taxing was said to have netted £500,000 from a single victim. These were the allegations presented at trial. Leicester Divers was not alive to defend himself against them. He could not stand in a witness box and give his version of events. He could not challenge the claims or offer context. He was dead, and the court heard only what the prosecution and the defence chose to present. That is important to keep in mind. Allegations made in court about a person who cannot respond carry a particular weight, and they should be treated with some care. But the fact remains that the judge, Mr. Justice Treacy, described the murder of Leicester Divers as the result of a turf war between 2 rival gangs involved in the supply of drugs. He called it a well-planned and cold-blooded execution, while the court accepted that this killing was rooted in the drug trade. And that is what makes this case so uncomfortable. Because it means both versions of Leicester Divers can be true at the same time. He can be the man his friends loved and the man the court described. He can be the charming music promoter and the alleged violent criminal. He can be the victim of a horrifying execution and a person who was deeply embedded in a world where that kind of violence was a known and accepted risk. One truth does not cancel out the other. They sit side by side, and the tension between them is what makes the Leicester Divers case something more than just another gangland killing. Because the reality is that people are not one thing. The men and women who get pulled into the drug trade in places like Burngreave and Pitsmoor are not cartoon villains. They are people who grew up in specific communities under specific circumstances and made specific choices, some of which were devastating for other people. Understanding that does not mean excusing what they did. It means acknowledging that the world is more complicated than a simple story of good and bad. Leicester Divers had friends who genuinely loved him. He also allegedly caused serious harm to other human beings. Both of those things exist at the same time. The people connected to his murder tell a similar story of complexity. Michael Uller, the man who pulled the trigger, was 47 years old at the time of the killing. He was a heroin and cocaine addict. His 21-year-old son, Lee Grantham, was also an addict. The house on Grey Street in Pitsmoor, where Uller lived, was, according to the testimony given at trial, a place where drugs were used openly and where the sawn-off shotgun was prepared in plain view of the people staying there. Ullar's defence was that he shot Divers because he believed Divers and 2 other men were planning to kidnap, torture, and possibly kill him. Whether that was a genuine fear or a convenient legal argument, nobody can say with certainty. What is certain is that Uller walked up to a car on a quiet street and shot a man in the head, and then went shopping the next morning with carrier bags full of new clothes and cash. Kevin Smith, the getaway driver, was 42 and from Barnsley. He drove Uller to Freedom Road, waited while a man was executed, and then drove him away from the scene. When they got back to Uller's house, Smith told the women present that if anyone asked, they were to say he had been with them all day and all night. He kept repeating it. Craig Allen, the man the prosecution said ordered the killing, and who was found not guilty by a jury after around 7 hours of deliberation, went on to run a global drug network from a mansion in Thailand. His criminal convictions dated back to 1975, nearly 3 decades before the murder of Leicester Divers. The Crown Prosecution Service called him the linchpin of a global drugs conspiracy and one of the most significant drug traffickers ever prosecuted in Yorkshire and Humberside. He used more than 18 different mobile phones to avoid detection. He was eventually caught outside an IKEA in Amsterdam with 3 kilos of cocaine, a kilo of heroin, and nearly €500,000 in cash in his flat. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. These were not master criminals operating in the shadows. These were people from Sheffield, from Barnsley, from Mansfield, from Parson Cross. They grew up in ordinary communities. They made choices that led them into a world where extreme violence was a business tool. Craig Allen allegedly paid to have Leicester divers killed. The morning after the killing, the people involved went to Argos and Matalan to buy kitchen appliances with the money. That detail says something about the banality of the world these men operated in. A man is shot dead on a quiet street. 12 hours later, someone is buying a washing machine with the proceeds. And then there is the aftermath. The part of the story that stretches far beyond the courtroom. Leicester Divers' nephews, Noel Ramsey, Aaron Divers, my Isaac Ramsey, all ended up in the justice system for serious violent offences. Noel Ramsey killed Fahim Hersey, a 22-year-old from Broomhall, outside a cinema in 2018 and was jailed for 5 years for manslaughter. The Sheffield Star reported that he struck out and killed a man despite knowing the heartache that serious violence causes after his own uncle was murdered 15 years earlier. Aaron Divers was wanted by police in connection with the fatal shooting of 23-year-old Asil Al-Essay in 2017. Isaac Ramsey was convicted of manslaughter in 2021 after the fatal stabbing of 35-year-old Marcus Ramsey, a father of 2, at a house party in Firth Park. 3 members of one extended family. 3 separate incidents of fatal violence. All traced back by the press who reported on each case, to the same starting point: the murder of Leicester Divers on Freedom Road in 2003. The neighbourhoods where all of this happened, Burngreave, Pittsmore, Walkley, Firth Park, are real places where real people live. They are not just settings in a crime story. They are communities with schools and shops and parks and families who have nothing to do with the drug trade. But the drug trade and the violence it brings cast a shadow over these communities that is impossible to ignore. When a 21-year-old man named Lamar Leroy Griffiths can be shot dead at a car wash on Burngreave Road in 2022, a man his own mother said was not even the intended target, and his killers can flee the country and remain uncharged 3 years later, that shadow is not getting any lighter. Leicester Divers was 32 years old when he died on New Year's Day, 2003. He was sitting in his Lexus outside his girlfriend Sophie Gibson's house on Freedom Road in Walkley, Sheffield. A man named Michael Uller walked up to the car and fired a sawn-off shotgun at point-blank range into his head. Divers slumped forward, his body pressed against the steering wheel. The car horn sounded across the quiet street and did not stop. His killer, Michael Uller, pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 16 years. His getaway driver, Kevin Smith, was found guilty of murder and also received a life sentence. The man accused of organising the killing, Craig Allen, was found not guilty by a jury and then was sentenced to 20 years in prison a decade later for running an international drug empire. At the trial, armed police surrounded Sheffield Crown Court. When the verdicts were read out, half the public gallery stormed downstairs and tried to force their way into the courtroom. Sophie Gibson sat on the front row and did not move. The funeral was held at Christ Church in Pittsmore. The church was not big enough. A horse-drawn hearse carried the coffin. The Blades business crew said they had lost one of their favourite sons. 23 years later, Freedom Road is still a quiet street. The houses are still there. The cars are still parked outside. But the sound of that car horn, the one that woke the neighbours on New Year's morning in 2003, the one that would not stop because the man behind the wheel was dead, has never really faded. It echoes through every shooting on Grimesthorpe Road, every stabbing outside a cinema, and every young man from Burngreave who ends up standing in the dock at Sheffield Crown Court. It echoes through the families who lost someone and through the communities that are still waiting for the violence to stop. Leicester Divers was two things at once: a man people loved, and a man the court said was part of a world that destroys lives. That contradiction never got resolved. It just sat there on a quiet street in Walkley and refused to go away. If you found this deep dive worth your time, make sure to subscribe. I will see you in the next video.